Justice is never given. It is exacted, and the struggle must be continuous, for freedom is never a final fact, but a continuing, evolving process to higher and higher levels of human, social, economic, political, and religious relationship. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrich, the alternate historian, and what you just heard was a quote from civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph, who just so happens to be the subject of my next What If. A. Philip Randolph is an oft-forgotten leader of the civil rights movement who probably deserves a lot more credit for his role in it than history gives him. Born on April 15, 1889, to parents who firmly believed in racial equality, Randolph grew up in Florida, but due to limited opportunities available to a person of color back then, he eventually moved to New York City in 1911, where he worked odd jobs while studying at the City College of New York. While in New York, Randolph became acquainted with the works of Karl Marx and the ideology of socialism, which inspired his form of civil rights activism. Per Randolph, capitalism is to blame for racism being rampant throughout America. To fight both racism and capitalism, Randolph encouraged black workers to join unions and made several attempts to organize them. In 1917, Randolph founded The Messenger with the help of the Socialist Party of America. This radical magazine opposed lynching, fought for an integrated society, and urged African Americans to join unions. Through its pages, Randolph also argued African Americans should resist being drafted into World War I, because the American idea of making the world safe for democracy was, and I quote, a tremendous offense to the intelligence of the blacks, because at the time the blacks were being lynched and denied the right to vote, in the South especially, and were the victims of segregation and discrimination all over the nation. Unfortunately, this drew the ire of the feds, and to make matters worse, African-American leftists began fighting each other over whether or not to support communism in light of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Ultimately, Randolph decided not to, and thus readership in The Messenger declined. Perhaps a lesser person would have given up, but Randolph kept fighting for better working conditions for people of color. In 1925, he founded and led the first predominantly African-American labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which is the first real attempt to organize the employees of the Pullman Company. Although the union struggled to force Pullman to bargain with them, following the election of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, membership in the union grew, and eventually the company agreed to a contract with them in 1937. As one person put it, a small band of brothers, black, had stood together and won against a corporation that said it would never sit down and negotiate with porters. This success propelled Randolph to national fame, so when FDR issued a statement confirming segregation in the military in 1940, Randolph and other civil rights leaders proposed a July 1, 1941 march on Washington to protest racism in the war industries, segregation in the military, and demand an anti-lynching law. Opening the war industries up to blacks was especially important, and it was helping white people emerge from the Great Depression, but segregation prevented black people from enjoying the same privilege. Randolph's proposed march was inspired in part by Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent protests against the British occupation in India, which Randolph hoped to replicate in America by getting at least 10,000 African Americans to show up. Throughout 1940 and 1941, he traveled across the country to promote the march, and while he met some resistance from whites and blacks, he nevertheless found support among black leaders and organizations. Word soon spread from word of mouth in black newspapers. Funds were raised to charter trains and buses to bring African Americans from across America. The plan also featured simultaneous marches on city halls across the country. By the time June 1941 rolled around, instead of 10,000, some were predicting 50 to 100,000 African Americans would be marching in Washington, which at the time was one of the most segregated cities in America. Ultimately, it was canceled after FDR issued Executive Order 8802, which barred discrimination in the war industries. Some activists were a little upset that the military wasn't desegregated, but nevertheless, the march was canceled. Randolph would, however, end segregation in the military when he forced FDR's successor, President Harry Truman, to issue Executive Order 9981 in 1948. You see, when Truman was up for re-election in 1948, Randolph threatened to organize a campaign of civil disobedience among African Americans by having them refuse to register for the draft. As Randolph put it, Negroes are in no mood to shoulder a gun for democracy abroad so long as they are denied democracy here at home. Fearing Randolph would make good on his threat, Truman issued the order, and once again, Randolph made the President of the United States of America back down. Nevertheless, Randolph was not done yet. In 1957, Randolph allied with another civil rights leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Together they organized marches in the South, which were often attacked by police and the KKK. Rather than defeat the civil rights movement, it only made it stronger, as Americans across the country watched in horror, thanks to the miracle of television, as their fellow Americans were brutally beaten by racist thugs. The violence in the South became such an embarrassment that President John F. Kennedy drafted civil rights legislation to finally end the racist Jim Crow laws in the South. And then, in 1963, Randolph finally got his March on Washington, where King famously delivered his I Have a Dream speech, which is still discussed in American classrooms to this day. The march attracted almost 300,000 people and kept the civil rights movement alive in the public consciousness. Although JFK's assassination did temporarily delay any civil rights law, a Civil Rights Act was finally passed in 1964 under the administration of President Lyndon B. Johnson. A year later, the Voting Rights Act was passed, which among other things prohibited governments, especially in the South, from imposing any restrictions on voting based on race. In 1979, Randolph passed away, having led some of the most important events of the civil rights movement. As Congressman John Lewis once said, not to take away from the role of Dr. King or anyone else, but without A. Philip Randolph, there wouldn't have been a March on Washington. People should never, ever forget the role that A. Philip Randolph played. He should be looked at as one of the founding fathers of a new America, a better America. And maybe we did get a better America. However, I can't help but ask, what if Randolph actually went through on his March on Washington in 1941? The promise to march on Washington was enough to make one of the most powerful men in the world give in to Randolph, and when the march did happen, it made America carry out even greater change. So one wonders, what if the march took place earlier? Granted, we need to find a point of divergence. Perhaps FDR stubbornly refuses to give any concrete promises of improving the lives of African Americans, like Executive Order 8802, or Randolph refuses to concede on desegregating the military. Either way, the march takes place on July 1st, 1941. So, what happens next? Well, there is the possibility that things could backfire for everyone involved. After all, there was concern that so many African Americans arriving in D.C. would overwhelm what amenities were available to blacks in the city, which could lead to nasty confrontations when the marchers attempted to make use of restaurants or hotels that were whites only. But there is no guarantee that would happen. The 1941 organizers certainly made efforts to find lodging and supplies for everyone arriving, and with America steadily being drawn into World War II, I think FDR would do everything he could to stop a race war from breaking out in the Capitol if he couldn't prevent the march from happening. Speaking of the war, when I mentioned I was making this video, a couple people expressed concern that the march would be seen as divisive at a time when national unity was needed due to the war. This is a fair point, but I'm not convinced. Frankly, it's hard to argue that African Americans were somehow being unpatriotic by holding a civil rights march in 1941. They were literally trying to get hired at war industries so they could build weapons for the military. The very same military they wanted to serve in, with the same rights as white people. Even Randolph seemed ready for this argument when he said, and I quote, "No propaganda could be whipped up and spread to the effect that Negroes seek to hamper defense. No charge could be made that Negroes are attempting to mar national unity. They want to do none of these things, but certainly there can be no national unity when 1/10 of the population are denied their basic rights as American citizens." Also, the 1963 March on Washington happened during war times, specifically the Vietnam War. Thousands of American troops were stationed in South Vietnam in 1963, and tens of thousands more would arrive in the years to come. So if the civil rights movement could survive that war, perhaps it can survive World War II as well. Also, this is the same America that got sick of Charles Lindbergh, that famous aviator, because he was a little too racist and pro-Nazi. So I think this America can handle one civil rights march, don't you think? So the 1941 march brings close to 100,000 African Americans, and it turns out to be completely peaceful. But does it accomplish anything? Well, I'd assume it would show the country how well black votes could be organized, which might not mean much in the South at the time, but would have a major impact in the northern states where African Americans had more rights and could decide elections, much as Truman feared in our timeline. So FDR probably would push through some reforms, either by executive order or congressional action. So on top of desegregating the war industries, you might see FDR even desegregate the military before 1948. This means integrated units could be fighting during World War II. Such changes might even push forward the timetable of other civil rights victories. We could see a Civil Rights Act or a Voting Rights Act passed before the 1960s, maybe even a sooner end to school segregation, or a federal anti-lynching bill. And then there's the question of, how would Randolph's life be different? In our timeline, socialist presidential candidate Norman Thomas tried to get Randolph to run as president under the Socialist Party in 1948, but Randolph refused because he was more focused on his union work and the civil rights movement. But in this alternate timeline, A successful march on Washington in 1941 might convince him that he could do more good by running for national office. His fame would certainly draw in the black vote, but his campaigns against all forms of discrimination and his decades-long support for the labor movement could bring in votes from all races in America. As Randolph once said, "The history of the labor movement in America proves that the employing classes recognize no race lines. They will exploit a white man as readily as a black man. They will exploit any race or class in order to make profits." Now, I don't think he would win, but much like Huey Long's populist rhetoric forced FDR to swing further left when it came to the New Deal, as I discussed in my top 5 more U.S. dictatorship what-if videos, Randolph might cause Truman to do the same in 1948. Or maybe Randolph running means Dewey actually wins. Who knows? Now, I know some of you are thinking that this is a very optimistic timeline. And yeah, it is. I'm assuming the best case scenario for a lot of things, which means very little racist or anti-leftist backlash. But after surviving 2020, I think we all need a little optimism. Because while the 1941 March on Washington never happened, the mere possibility of it happening changed America. And when it did happen in 1963, it changed America again. And while we can't really change history, we can learn from the almost was when looking toward the future. A. Philip Randolph is an inspiration to all Americans by showing us the power we can wield against the forces of greed and bigotry when we all stand together, united. Well, that's up to say on the subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.